All right, looks like the waiting room is empty for now, so we'll just go ahead and get started. Like I said, for those of you who were on just a second ago, I'm Paige McCaleb, and I work at the University of Glasgow in our research support office. And it's my pleasure and my daily delight to be the one who works through coordinating our external partnerships. And so part of that is being a part of a consortium called Aspect, which is a group of universities, private sector businesses, as well as kind of other industry partners across the UK who work towards exploring commercialization, entrepreneurship, and business engagement, and what that looks like for social sciences very specifically. So as part of that, we've invited Cash to come and partner with us today and do a bit of a talk on kind of what they are doing regarding external partnerships and how they're doing this really cool retrofitting project with partners across different universities, the construction sector, as well as other businesses in Glasgow. So Ken will be taking over for me in just a second here to tell you about this exciting new project. And if I can just remind everyone, the second half of this webinar will be focused around a Q&A. So if you would just ask any questions that you have in the chat function, that would be wonderful. And then we'll get around to those after Ken goes through his presentation here.
Hello everybody, my name's Ken Gibb. I'm now finally able to speak to you. I hope everyone can hear me now. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this project and also a little bit about Cash. There's still a few folk who probably don't know everything that you need to know about us. We are actually doing another seminar with Paige's team next week, which is more about what Cash does as a whole. So I'm going to keep that fairly minimal down to just one slide. And let me get on with that now. So Cash has been around since 2017. We're funded by the ESRC, AHRC and Joseph Rowntree Foundation, initially for 5 years. We're a considerable housing investment in housing research terms, and the core team is based in Glasgow. We have our consortium right across the UK in all 4 nations. The biggest parts are probably Glasgow, Sheffield, Cardiff and Bristol, but also we are partnered up with the Chartered Institute of Housing and the Royal Town Planning Institute. We've got 29 co-investigators across something like 14 different institutions, and we are, I think, characteristically multidisciplinary. We focus on evidence, we try to maximize impact, and we invest a lot of our time on knowledge exchange. And as I say, next week, we're going to do a seminar about the work of Cash and relate it in particular to the private rented sector, as we've done a suite of policies in that respect. However, what I'm going to talk about today is about this very interesting project. If I can get my slides to move, I'm having great fun with the technology today. So let me tell you what the objectives are of this webinar. First of all, I want to set it in the kind of urban Scottish Glasgow tenemental context and some of the key problems and policy initiatives and challenges that are faced, in particular the low carbon challenge and the context of the COP26 conference. I'm going to describe the project both in terms of its underlying theory of change, the kind of demonstration project that we as this partnership are trying to undertake, and think a little bit about its replicability or its scalability and the limits to that. And in particular, I'm going to, in the second half of the presentation, talk about the challenges facing the project and how they might be overcome. And secondly, and in relation to Aspect, I suppose, think a little bit about some of the business opportunities that might be created as a result of the work. So let's start with the context. And I guess the context really begins with the fact that carbon reduction is not just about new build housing and the regulations and standards we set for new build housing, but it's actually primarily about the existing housing stock. The existing housing stock dominates the housing system. There's an awful lot of it, and it's going to be around till 2040, 2050 onwards, and it's going to make up most of the housing that needs to be adapted to meet the carbon reduction approach to net zero. And a city like Glasgow is actually a city of tenements, often sandstone tenements, traditional tenements. There are something like 175,000 pre-1919 tenements in Scotland, and Glasgow has, if not the lion's share, has the largest number of them in the country. So we're talking about tens of thousands of properties that potentially will need to have some major retrofitting done. Or I guess the other option is that we simply move away from that kind of housing, and we have a kind of redevelopment program. But of course, for people in Glasgow and for people wider afield, tenemental housing is a kind of iconic form of housing that people want to protect and sustain as long as they can. And indeed, we know that in the 70s, 80s and 90s, there was considerable reinvestment in that tenement stock. So these buildings are largely made up of porous sandstone, which is a terrible carbon emitter. So there's some quite serious work that needs to be done to do something about that. And alongside this, the City Council has a kind of strategic interest in trying to protect and sustain as much of the tenemental stock as it can. And it's having to think of what's the best strategic way to try and approach that and achieve that. And of course, it links in a very timely way to COP26, which should have happened this year, but it's now going to happen towards the end of 2021. And we would hope to bring some of the findings of our retrofit project to that venue. And finally, it's also worth saying, of course, that tenement built form itself is a very challenging one, and we're going to talk about some of those challenges as we go along. But I will move on just now, tell you a little bit about how the project came about. So back in the early autumn of 2019, Scottish Funding Council announced what they called a climate emergency call, where they agreed to fund 2 projects out of a competition with bidding closing in October 2019. And each project could be funded up to £250,000. So we bid, we put in a bid worth about £235,000, but plus a lot of in-kind support as well. And we turned out to be successful. So the retrofit that we're interested in concerns 8 empty 1-bed pre-1919 tenements, which had been owned by private landlord in the inner south side of the city in Ridley Road, which is somewhere in between Govan Hill and Strathbungo East, for those of you who know that part of Glasgow. And the property is now owned by a social housing landlord, Southside Housing Association. And because the properties are empty, they clearly have complete control over the units, and there's scope to do something quite innovative and flexibly different with it. And they wanted to pursue a kind of retrofit standard to a high standard. And in the sense, what the Scottish Funding Council work does is it's an evaluation of that demonstration project, and then a sort of assessment of how replicable or scalable is that. So the bid was like a 2-week process from my first conversation with the director of Southside Housing Association through to actually building a partnership, doing the funding, sorting out the intellectual side of it, meeting with the various partners and getting a bid organised and submitted. And we managed to succeed. I think we succeeded because we were quite different to the kinds of other projects that were submitted. It's a very practical project, obviously. It's a very big policy and practical issue for Glaswegians. There's opportunities here for shared learning, for knowledge mobilisation. There's actually opportunities for economic business development, as I'm going to talk about. And it's a collaboration. It's a very genuine collaboration which can lead to work associated with COP26 and climate change. So we ticked a lot of boxes. We brought a lot of people on side. We also worked very hard to get the project together. And just to go back a slide, I'll show you the building again. This is the actual building in Ridley Road. As you can see, four stories, 1-bedroom flats, looking out onto Main Street. It's just got a train station about 50 yards away from it as well, which is very, very handy. And that's the site of where the work will take place. So this is a kind of simplistic logic model or theory of change of what it is that we're trying to do. And I think it's quite a useful way of getting one's head fixed around what's going on. I can tell you a little bit about the people involved. So the situation needs pretty clear. There's a large number of pre-19 tenements, 1919 tenements facing these carbon target carbon reductions. It's about retaining this iconic Glasgow built form, but it also has to be affordable in the sense of being affordable to the funders of such a retrofit, but also affordable to the end users, in this case, the tenants of Southside Housing Association, but equally if it was another tenure, it'd have to be affordable to them too. And as we're going to talk about, clearly there's something very distinctive about this project. We have control over 8 units, which are all owned by a housing association, but that doesn't in any way reflect the actual structure, tenure structure and ownership structure of the wider tenemental stock. So we have to be aware of that multiple ownership kind of issue. The inputs box tells us a little bit people who are participating. So in the partnership, so apart from cash, the Strathclyde University who are leading the technical evaluation. Southside Housing Association are obviously the project lead. We're working with a team of architects who are expert in this kind of whole area of conservation and climate change, green kind of retrofitting and passive house and Enerfit and things of that kind. I'll talk more about John Gilbert in a minute. We're working with Glasgow City Council who've made a big contribution to the funding of the project, the actual construction project. Our construction partners are CCG, and of course Scottish Funding Council are funding the evaluation. So there's quite a lot of different interests and stakeholders involved in the work. One of the things that's interesting about what we're doing is we're not actually doing one evaluation, we're probably doing 4 or 5, and I'll show you a slide in a minute of the different slides. But if you think of the different evaluations, but if you think about it, we're trying to understand how a demonstration project works, what the key decisions are. We're trying to understand the building's performance before and after in theory and in practice once the retrofitting is undertaken. And we're also trying to understand the costs and benefits of that project. And then we're trying to think about the challenges and the opportunities to scale up or learn lessons from this project. So a lot of things are going on. And in the final box, we talk about some of the benefits that there might be here. Hopefully we'll have benefits beyond Glasgow. It will help us think more clearly about kind of behavioural change, because one of the challenges in all this is how do you convince the users of property to make the most of the retrofit? In other words, how do you encourage them to make the biggest savings from it, to use the property in the most sensible way? And there are many other features here that I think are very important about the aims of what we're trying to do. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the kind of logic of the approach. John Gilbert's did this nice cutout diagram of Ridley Road to give us a sense of the kind of ideas that we're planning. It should be said that nothing is set in stone yet. There isn't a final decision on every aspect of the work that's going to be done. But the kind of things we're talking about are external insulation at the rear of the building, internal insulation throughout, triple glazing of the windows, a number of mechanical ventilation, heat recovery and wastewater heat recovery processes, as well as some repair work which is linked to the retrofit itself, and also some rethinking of the layout itself in terms of space. But as I'm going to come back to in a minute, there are a number of choices here, and not all of these things will work out exactly as they're laid out in the diagram. The diagram more to give you a kind of a set of menu of choices and things that will probably occur as we do the work. So these are the different evaluation projects that we're considering. The first one is the one at the centre, the Valuability Assessment, and this is some work that we've actually already done. This is really getting all the stakeholders to sit down together and understand the different needs that they have in order to build a kind of theory of change that what we're trying to achieve with the work itself and the evaluation, and where that goes thereafter. So we've actually done that. We've held three workshops over the last, really over the months of May and June. We have found that very useful as a process. I'm going to talk more about that in the questions and answers if you want. But I think it's given us a sense of why we're doing the evaluations, and perhaps the format and the challenges that will flow from trying to do them. Around the centre are 4 kind of aspects of the work, and I'll just say a little bit more about each of these. So first of all, the demonstration project by definition is a one-off, and we are making decisions as we go along to try to work out the best way to proceed. And partly that's things that are under our control, and partly that's kind of things that happen in the wider environment which we need to respond to. So we thought it was very important that we capture those things as they happen, and we monitor and record the decisions that are made and why they're made. So this is kind of like a kind of action research in real time, and we're building up a kind of sense of how and why decisions were made. We think that's really important from a replicability sense, but it means that when we're trying to share the learning of this, we can say these are the key issues that arose for us and might arise in other contexts. This is how we went about making a decision about what to do, and we think that's going to be a very useful process. Secondly, and at the core of all this, we're trying to measure the carbon and the energy efficiency changes that happen to the building as a result of the works that are done. So there's a pre-change period, there's a post-change period, there's an occupancy period, and there's also the kind of theoretical desk-based measures that we calculated changes to carbon emissions. And we want to compare them to the practice of what actually happens. So that, as I say, is the work that's been led by Strathclyde. Thirdly, we're going to look at the financials, the costs and benefits, the financial appraisal of what's done and what actually happened in practice. And again, that's partly a piece of work which compares the kind of the position of what we expect at the cost before we do it with the actual experience of the cost of the work as they're carried out. Fourthly, we want to then try and share the learning of this work in a broader scale, and we have quite a generous budget to think about events and activities where we can talk to interested parties, to media, to landlords, housing associations, etc., to talk about the findings that we've had and the lessons that we've learned for a wider programme. And part of that is going to be thinking about the delivery models and the different ways of funding these things for different kinds of programme, depending, for instance, on tenure structure and such like. That's probably the least known part of all this at this stage, but certainly a very interesting part. So as you can see, it's quite a big and complex multi-strand project, all coming out of one building of 8 pre-1919 flats. What are the challenges we face? Well, there's probably other challenges, but the challenges that strike one initially are the following, I think. COVID-19 has been a major setback for us, as it has been for everyone, because of course it stopped construction work and it stopped many normal aspects of the housing world in its tracks. So the Housing Association had to focus on just carrying out its core functions. It had to deal with furloughing and all sorts of other stuff. City Council had to cope with working from home and setting up the IT practices to allow that to happen. So all of these things, plus the fact that construction ceased altogether, meant that the project, in a sense, ceased. It certainly ceased in the sense of the construction work, but it didn't stop us spending a lot of the last 5 months talking through and thinking through many of the issues that we have to face. So I think in the long term, that's going to be tremendously beneficial, but it does mean that from an accountability point of view, as a research project or as a construction project, we're now several months in arrears, and we have to kind of reshape things on that basis. But as I say, it's been tremendously useful to have that time to just, on a weekly to bi-weekly basis, to sit down and talk about the project and the choices that we've got. I should stress, as if it's not already obvious, that I am not a technical expert. I'm learning every week on this project, and I'm really not that well placed to answer technical questions at all. But I certainly know a lot more now than I did 4 or 5 months ago. A second issue that's really important is path dependency. And this is really important for the kind of scalability and replicability of what we find, I think. Basically, we have to work with whatever we confront. Whatever happened in the past, which led to the development of specific forms of housing in specific places, is going to shape and constrain what's possible to be done in a retrofit. It's a kind of pretty obvious point, but it does mean that different tenements in different places in different conditions will have different opportunities for retrofit. That's a great leveler in a sense, and it greatly reduces the scope to simply transferably take one policy and how it worked in one place to another. But that's not to say there's not lots to learn from the initial demonstration project. Of course there is. There are also challenges because a lot of this is really about preventative spending. Improving the properties through retrofit means that not only do you reduce carbon emissions, but you also hopefully increase energy efficiency and affordable warmth. So there are long-term benefits, paybacks over time to something, but it does have an upfront cost. And it's how you make that upfront cost incentive compatible. What combination of public and private finance, of user versus society paying the burden of these things? How do you make that work in different circumstances? That's a huge challenge. That's the huge challenge of thinking about scaling up such a project. There are well-known other issues to do with tenemental housing, which we have to deal with as well. The problems of common work, maintenance challenges. There's recently been a very interesting maintenance piece of research done by RICS in the Scottish Parliament, which raised a number of issues. I'll come back to my final slide. There's also multiple ownership issues. If you have several owners in one property, how do you facilitate a property-wide retrofit? These are all difficult issues. So in addition to that, there's a fundamental cost issue. We think that the tenement that we're working in our demonstration project is going to cost north of 25,000 per unit to do the retrofit. That's a lot of money, obviously. So where's it going to be funded from? What budgets are involved? How do you maximize the benefit of it by making sure that those behavioral changes I talked about earlier do happen? How do you incentivize people? How do you make it affordable? These are all things that we have to think through. And what's become clear to me in the last few weeks of talking to my colleagues in the partnership is that the outcomes and actually the choices we make are trade-offs of a number of factors, not all of which we can control. So at one level, there's what works in a technical and efficient sense. But alongside that is what's affordable, what's less affordable, particularly for the client groups you're talking about. Also, there's a question of what meets the institutional constraints you faced, and they may be political with a small p. They may be about the planning system and how the planning system responds to what you do. It might be, for instance, to do with the heritage and conservation movement and what they think about what you plan to do to the external look of a tenement. A good example of this is the heating system conundrum. So the properties currently have gas boilers. There's obviously the shift going on to forms of electric heating, and we have to think about the choices of which ones of these that we might choose, and it's not straightforward. Different forms of system have different kinds of advantages. They also have different kinds of problems. Air source heat pumps, for instance, if they are plugged into the back of a building, may raise some planning concerns. They may also be noisy. If you have electrical systems, just straightforward electrical systems, then that can create, it means there's some things you can't do, which you can do actually with gas. So there's a number of trade-offs that have to be made. And where we're at just now, and again, it's not completely set in stone, what we're thinking of is to have a range of heating systems across the 8 units, again, to try to maximize the learning that we can get from it, rather than just have the one system throughout. So I think all of this suggests that there are some challenges in scaling up, but I think there's an awful lot we can learn from this, which can inform how you might roll out retrofit in other places and in other ways. So I'm going to move on now to my final slide, which is to finally talk about the kind of business opportunity that exists in all of this. And I think if you follow the housing literature and the kind of new reports that come out in places like Think House, you can't fail to have seen the interest that there's been of late, particularly in terms of COVID and the economic recovery and building back better, that there's a lot of interest in retrofit, both as a climate change agent, as it were, but also in terms of its potential economic scope for jobs, output, savings, and such like. So give you some examples. There are some enabling factors, arguably, that might create the background for or facilitate new economic opportunities. The Scottish Parliament RICS Tenement Maintenance Inquiry talk about a number of things that they think would be useful for improving tenement maintenance, things like regular inspections, establishing through law homeowner associations, and also constructing kind of sinking funds or reserve funds for properties. Also, the Green Finance Institute have written a really interesting report about exactly this question: how do you scale up and develop a market that can deliver and fund retrofit in existing housing stock? And they've done a really interesting piece of work where they've tried to identify what the barriers are, who the key stakeholders are, and then think about both the data you need, the hurdles you have to overcome legally, etc. And then think about various finance and delivery models that could be used, which might include guarantees, tax breaks, grants, clever forms of green private finance, etc. And all of these things can create the conditions by which it may be possible to do something more strategic. And in that light, IPPR have just in the last few weeks released a report which is called All Hands to the Pump, a home improvement plan for England, which is an explicit attempt to think about a retrofit strategy across England and potentially across the UK, using air source heat pumps to build a major investment in retrofit, which would have obviously climate change benefits, but would employ hundreds of thousands of people, generate multiplied economic outcomes, but also in the longer term reduce the energy costs of people and give them more consumption power as a consequence of that. So, and I would definitely recommend people have a look at that IPPR report. It's a very, very interesting document because it focuses on some of the really difficult problems of such a strategy, such as how do you scale up the training, how do you find the finance, how do you convert a business from doing one kind of form of construction into something like that. It's a really interesting piece of work. So I think I want to finish there. What I've tried to do is suggest why the project came about, suggest the kind of shape and structure of it and the theory of change underlying it, some of the challenges it faces, and in particular, why that might be a business opportunity for the economy. I think the final thing I would say is just where we are right now. We have only recently, obviously, restarted construction. We're still sorting out the final details of the demonstration project itself. So our evaluation will follow and train with that. But it's very exciting, and we greatly look forward to seeing how the work develops over the next 6 to 9 months. So thanks very, very much, and I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, Ken. Like I said earlier, this is such an interesting project. I think, particularly in our in this kind of stream of work for us that's we've always done in the college, but is relatively new, is a formalized bit around engagement with the private sector and really encouraging our researchers inside the College of Social Sciences to think more entrepreneurially. And I think this is such an exemplar of that, both obviously in this kind of really multifaceted partnership model that you've that's just embedded to the core of this, but also in the sense that you and the team of researchers are thinking in some sense very entrepreneurially around having kind of the end user in mind from the get-go of how are people going to use these retrofitted tenements, and what that model of change of if we put all these things in place but they're not being used to their most efficient, what's the point in thinking of that from the beginning. It is all very interesting and all kind of part and parcel of this, of the way, in a lot of ways, that research is going, where we're thinking more entrepreneurially, we're thinking in a way of those partnerships as well. So that's all very interesting. Right, well, it looks like we've got questions kind of pouring in. I'll go ahead and give people just a second more to put those in, and and put the first question forward myself, one kind of around the partnerships that are happening. You've got so many stakeholders in this. We've got, researchers, we've got from multiple universities, we have, the housing associations, private sector businesses from architecture to the construction companies and the council. How are you guys going about kind of organizing that partnership and keeping it so it's a really positive interaction between all of the partners and collaborators that obviously have the goal of retrofitting this and making it a usable thing, but also have kind of some of their own agendas or their own kind of spins or outcomes they want to see out of the project?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. We have to first of all separate out the construction project from the evaluation project. They aren't the same thing, but they're obviously intimately connected. And I think we have always been when we're having conversations amongst the stakeholders, we are always having to go and check ourselves to make sure what exactly are we talking about here. Are we talking about the Scottish Funding Council evaluation project? Are we talking about the actual construction work? Because we all kind of feel an ownership of the former, but I know I definitely have the ownership of the latter, and I'm responsible for the making sure that it all comes together. But of course, the latter, the evaluation, depends on the construction project actually delivering what it's supposed to deliver. How we work at the moment, actually, I mean, there's two elements to that partnership being a living thing, I think. One is that, as I hinted at earlier, we have four kind of principal people involved in the evaluation. Myself, my colleague Tim Sharp at Strathclyde, who's the building performance expert, the director of Southside Housing Association, and the relevant person from John Gilbert Architects, who is leading the project, the construction project, essentially for the housing association. So we meet on a regular basis, and we have a very open and fluid discussion each week. They probably think it's far too open and fluid, whereas I think it's just about right. But it's been a great way of really getting into the issues and doing that, building up over time. So I strongly suspect I'm learning a lot more than they're learning from me, but it's been really fantastic. The other thing, though, that's been really important is the valuability assessment. So we've had three sets of meetings. I think one or two people are here on the call who are part of that, like Stacey from SFHA. But it's been great to have the City Council, senior people in City Council, senior people from CCG, the construction firm, working with us, doing a relatively academic exercise to understand why we're doing this evaluation, what's the best way to do it, what kind of data have you got, what's the theory of change that you're all trying to work to, how is that going to look like over different time periods. But people really bought into it. I think they were great and really invested a lot of care and thought into it. And I certainly felt at the end of that we'd come a long way, and we really hope that's what that would do. And you enter into something like that, it's a bit of a risky thing, but I think it worked very, very, very well. So that's a very early stage. But the good thing is, the valuability assessment also makes you think about what's the final stage of the evaluation. What's all this stuff going to be like when you're trying to disseminate it and share it and pass on the learning? What's the most effective ways of doing that? And that's been really good. I should also say, though, and just to close on this question, that everybody who's involved in the evaluation project have put in-kind contributions into it. So they've shown a real commitment. They've not just signed a bit of paper and said they're a partner. They're actually, there's an opportunity cost that they've been willing to bear to add to the project. And that's very, it's very welcome, but it does provide the buy-in that you want to have.
Thank you, Ken. So we've got quite a few questions here. I'll go ahead and kind of start at the top, if that's okay, and kind of work our way down some of these. I'll kind of start by fielding some of the ones that are a bit more partnership focused, and then we can, time dependent, maybe focused on, move to some of them that are maybe a tiny bit more technical.
Yes.
And whatnot, as I know that's not your specialty, so I'll try to work through the ones that that I think might be a little bit more relevant to partnership and collaboration and how this all translates to kind of that private sector research, the dance between the two, essentially. So let's see, one of the first ones here says, is there likely to be any further investigation into how replicable this is for tenements with privately owned flats within them?
Yes, in a word. So I mean, clearly the retrofit that we're looking at is a housing association property, social housing. And we obviously know that the great majority of tenement properties have got multiple ownership, that there are a large number of privately owned and privately rented properties. So we're going to investigate what the literature says about that, what the credibility of those kinds of models might be, and what the range of funding opportunities will be. So the Green Finance Institute that I mentioned, their report has a kind of matrix of 21 different models or approaches to funding different aspects of the existing housing stock, including not just tenemental housing, but a whole range of housing types. But it explicitly tries to think about, you know, the incentive problems. So a private landlord, you know, pays the upfront cost of a retrofit, but it's the tenant who actually gets the benefit initially in the form of lower heating costs and energy benefits. So what mechanisms do you use to square the gap that exists because of that? And then more generally for owner occupiers, there's a high upfront cost. How do you try to alleviate that, or to make the benefits more tangible more quickly? So there's different ways that are suggested that can be done. There's also somebody like the very trendy economist Mark Blythe has been talking about using sort of green finance and the state providing deeply subsidised loans to banks, provided they use them for green finance projects. And it could be projects such as this, which would, you know, have a significant impact on the upfront cost. So there are ideas out there, but what I'm not going to say is that one's better than the other just now. I think it's a bit like you need to have in the same way that you need a golf bag of different policy measures to tackle all sorts of public policy problems, I suspect you need a wide range of tools to try to tackle the different kind of housing situations you might confront, of ownership and of quality and condition, etc. But that doesn't mean that we can't formulate ideas on the back of the demonstration project.
That's a great answer to that one. I'm going to kind of do a segment here of a handful of questions that are all kind of along the same lines. I think asking important things kind of around ownership and the investment that it takes to get the tenements, I suppose, more fit for the carbon emissions initiatives that are happening. So this one is asking, in the past, private owners you know, have been told to spend into more visible things, new kitchens, new baths, that sort of thing. That would add more obvious value to the house for renters. Is there evidence, or I suppose will we be gathering evidence to see if this has changed for green values?
I think reading the literature, there does appear to be evidence that there are positive impacts on capital values. I don't know that literature well enough to sort of, you know, pull out a couple of specific numbers or authors, but I think this is partly a behavioural thing as well, isn't it? There's clearly a tipping point that comes when the kind of universal requirement of it, once the market itself grows to a certain point, one presumes that, you know, people will feel much more natural, that it's almost like a defensive thing to do, that you need to be doing this to preserve your property values, in the same kind of way that, to use an analogy, you can see the second-hand value of diesel fuel cars collapsing, perhaps in a sense that there's a tipping point as more success is made with retrofitting, that people will feel this has become, you know, a more natural part of what has to be done to protect property value, and in due course that it will actually be reflected to some extent in the property value. Whether you're going to make, I think it's a quite different matter to say that people are going to do well out of it. That's much further into the future, I suspect. But so it'll still be a cost, but it's the impact of not doing it. I think it's when that becomes important. It's probably what's urgent for people.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Especially kind of, I like the analogy that you put in there of what's happening with the diesel cars. Of, you know, it might at some point be kind of the same thing with, if you see there's, you know, single glazed windows in a flat, of, we know how poor that is for heating in our emissions, and that kind of might in turn become something that's significantly more and more and increasingly unattractive to renters. again, along the same lines here, this question is asking, how are you determining the right amount of retrofit? Household payback, whole society payback, carbon reduction cost, all of that. I suppose one of the things, if I could kind of add my own spin on that question, is when we talk about payback, if it does cost, 25K or thereabouts to retrofit a single unit, what's the payback on that? And how do we justify that cost for all sorts of different types of housing, whether it's social housing or a private owner? Where does that tie in?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly, on the one hand, the costs will be, the choices that we're thinking about with regard to these models are about that mix between essentially public sector costs or taxpayer costs vis-a-vis private costs, and there'll be a mixture there. And of course, clearly, we all pay both in a sense, but obviously the impact on the individual resident or owner is different depending on what that mix will be. And the mix will be, as I say, I think there should be a range of different opportunities, but you probably need to start to work quite hard to estimate the differential impacts of different schemes and whether they are, in a sense, much more generous or ungenerous for individual circumstances. So that's on the cost side. On the revenue side, clearly we're thinking about if people make best use of the new energy efficiency situation they confront post retrofit, then there are savings to be made in that sense. There's affordable warmth benefits, and that has a distributional profile, which is not an unimportant consideration, I suppose, in that obviously fuel poverty is a serious problem, particularly for otherwise disadvantaged households. So impacts on that have bigger proportionate impacts on them than they have on other groups. So the payback is a society cost versus a benefit to disadvantaged groups in a sense. So as your question's implying, the payback could be quite a long period of time relative to the original upfront cost, and that was the problem I was alluding to earlier on. That is a difficult thing to overcome unless you start to use a range of different options. So one might be some kind of equity loan finance where people in a sense invest in retrofitting. But there may be a number of other ways, maybe things like loan guarantees and things like that, which again would reduce the loan cost that's involved. So at one level, and what IPPR say in their report is that clearly there has to be a major injection by the state into this, but the point they're making is the social and economic value attached to that is considerable, and it's a social intergenerational investment that's being made. So it's that no one's pretending that these things wash their hands and make money in an early, regular, orderly way. If they did, one presumes they'd already be happening. So there has to be a kind of public sector commitment to it. So that's a bit of a weaselly answer in a sense. I don't think I've provided you with answers that solve the thing, but that's precisely why we're doing this work, to try and learn and hopefully be able to link some of the more conceptual work, like the Finance Institute's work, to real projects in practice and see what we can match up. I think if we even make progress in one or two areas with this, we're making progress, and that's got to be worth doing. I don't think it's a silver bullet or anything like that, but I think we're offering an opportunity to think really hard and invest time thinking hard about what can be done in a city like Glasgow, and that's got to be worthwhile. It's worthwhile just to be sitting here spending time really thinking hard about this, I think.
Perhaps to clarify some of that as well, or to narrow the kind of that question, I'm going to try to combine a few here. Hopefully I don't do it too clumsily. So when we talk about that figure around 25K, particularly in kind of, I would assume kind of the dissemination phase of this project, will there be some communication, I suppose, around kind of the breakdown of how much this actually costs, and perhaps the cost benefit of different parts you know, kind of if you install just this one thing, that's your biggest area of return, or this package of things might be the recommendation, as kind of part one of narrowing that question. And part two also, what will the kind of evaluation of how the tenants interact with the different bits that are installed in the house,
yeah.
And kind of what that return looks like when the house is in use for the tenants versus just what we think it might look like, given kind of fuel costs and the larger transition towards green initiatives.
Yeah, so there's quite a few things in that to unpack. I think we will definitely seek to use the cost benefit financial kind of analysis of the demonstration project to try to isolate the costs of individual components of the work that gets done, and in some way try to see to what extent we can match benefits to those individual components. Some of them are non-separable, I would think, I would imagine, but some of them you should be able to identify. There are some quite techie economic issues about how you value benefit in this respect, because clearly there are cost savings that we think apply from lower fuel costs, etc., and warmer homes, warmer systems, which will only be a benefit if people use them that way. But in the same way that there are costs to the public's purse, there are also benefits to the public purse. And in particular, there are, these are rather abstract kind of concepts, but there are technical ways of valuing carbon reduction under certain headings, and we are going to examine and explore the use of doing that to see what, in a sense, what the social benefit of these programs are, as well as their social and private cost and the social benefit and the private benefit. Sorry, so we are going to explore things like that. So OECD, IMF, the Treasury, they all have estimates of different forms of the monetary benefit of carbon reductions, and we think the carbon reductions are pretty big. So that's something that we feel we need to do. It may look like a bit of kind of social accounting rather than something that's perhaps real, but it does give you a sense of the social benefit that's attached to something, not just the private benefit. So actually I think that's really important. So yes, absolutely, on the financing side, that's what we propose to do. The other question relates to how we disseminate this and communicate it. So I wouldn't want to understate in any way the amount of time this project's going to devote to this. We're planning to hold several large conferences. We're planning to do a lot of much more bespoke work tailored at specific stakeholders, like social landlords, like private landlords, like the lending industry and the construction industry, to really try to communicate the things that we find, to discuss the potential opportunities that there might be. But also we need to talk to other professional groups who are potentially really important, but potentially are also a challenge. So the statutory planning system has an impact on what we can do, as do some other sorts of issues of that kind. So we need to be able to really communicate effectively. So the other area of thing was conservation. The building that we are working with isn't in a conservation area, but nonetheless it has some quite strict planning constraints on it. But of course, lots of tenants are in conservation areas, so that raises issues about what you can do and what you can't do, and that's part of the trade-off. So having a really thorough engagement and discussion with people who make decisions on those very real issues, and we know why people hold these views. It's what we can do, what middle ground there is, and what sort of ways we can work to bring these things on. But at the heart of it, as you hinted in the question, are the residents themselves. So a large part of how we disseminate has to be to speak directly to the people who live in properties, to make them think more about these things and potential benefits of them. And what we'd like to do, and what we might actually seek some further funding for, because it'll take us longer into the future, is to actually work with the residents in the demonstration property. Once nobody's in those properties just now, obviously, and once they do get occupied, we'd like to work with them to see how they use the properties and understand what they do and why they do it. We think you can't get enough of that kind of work, actually, and that's an important thing to do, and that's certainly part of what we plan to do.
Great. And I just saw another question come through that's perhaps an important point of clarification around how big the flats are.
Right.
Asking about kind of how many rooms and perhaps even the size of them, to give an idea of kind of the actual
Right.
space that we're talking about.
They're not big. I mean, they're one bed apartments. They are, you know, they have quite small bathrooms. They have a kind of, you know, they are, and they're, one of the things that we're considering is if there's scope to change the space a little bit to try and improve the size of them. But they're one bed flats, so that means they're for single people or for couples basically, and that's what you'd anticipate in them. Clearly, you know, if you were thinking about similar issues in Partick Hill or in Hindland, where there's some much bigger properties, or perhaps around Queen's Park or somewhere like that, then you know you're dealing with a completely different entity, and you know, the costs may be higher, but on the other hand, the costs may be lower because there's already been certain kinds of investment in these properties. We can't really make a linear assumption about the costs, I don't think, and size, but clearly these are small properties. And just thinking about it, another feature of this work, which is very different from what most people will confront, is the properties are empty, there's nobody in them. So it's not about doing work while people are in situ, you know, which can take a long time and can be very disruptive, and can also be a major barrier to people wanting to have the work done. But you know, also it will be a housing association who runs it, which has a different relationship with its tenants and its communities than other owners might have. So you know, you have to. We're not in any sense pretending that this is a completely generalizable model that we're working with. It's very specific. But as I say, I think there's still going to be considerable learning that we get from that, and things that we can hopefully transfer and translate. And one of the things we're actually interested in and talk to the council about is whether we could develop a kind of database of the tenemental stock in Glasgow about its size and type and location, because that would be very useful to help us factor up the kinds of scales of challenges and issues that apply here with this. So we're talking to the council about that just now.
Great. I'm just looking at the time here. We've got about 5 minutes left. I've got one more question. I know there's a couple that we haven't answered. However, these quite a few of them are a bit technical about kind of the types of heating, etc. So I'll throw in one more of my own questions that I think particularly speaks to kind of this moment in time that we're in, where we're obviously kind of anticipating and have already seen kind of significant economic shrinkage. And businesses as well as, you know, private ownership are looking to kind of spend incredibly smartly and incredibly lean currently. How does this project and other projects like it that are research based but eventually kind of informing businesses and private renters as well as other types of renters, how is it helping particularly private sector businesses make smart decisions around where they spend and how they're using their funds with a shrinking economy?
Well, I mean, I think there's probably lots of things it can potentially do. Whether it will do or not, we'll wait and see. But potentially, at least, I think we are in a context where there are a series of green kind of legislation or policy imperatives in place, where, you know, the energy rating of private rented properties has to improve. They have to all reach a minimum standard, and that's part of a broader process of trying to improve energy standards. So at one level, everybody involved in housing, be they lenders or surveyors or letting agents or landlords, etc., they all have an interest in being smart, as you say, and thinking about the long term, and thinking about the sustainability of property. And I mean sustainable in this context in terms of it being around for a long time. All of those things are going to necessitate doing something about some of these green issues. The retrofit work obviously depends on the mix of finance and where those sources are coming from. But if you follow the IPPR kind of logic, which is to have a a public program which is kind of mixed for finance, which is trying to encourage green private finance alongside public funding as well. That's got potential to, in a sense, use scarce public resources in an investment, a social investment way. It's good for the environment. It'll create jobs, and it'll create new jobs and new types of employment in the construction industry, and new skills also in the construction, manufacture and fitting of new forms of heating systems, etc., as well as the more normal construction jobs indoor, as it were. So all of that's, you know, people should sit up and take notice of that. You know, we all want the economy to recover in a sustainable way. This is an opportunity to build on, in Scotland's case, the growth of renewables, and to do something in a compatible way, which could be potentially really helpful for the economy, and does have, you know, should have multiplier effects attached to it, which will be helpful to the economy and reduce people's heating costs. It's all got to be made to stack up, and I'm not in any way diminishing how difficult that is to do, and I do recognise that there are specific problems, particularly in the private sector, about that initial capital cost and how you deal with that. So I think a really important feature of the next few months and years is to think through hard about how to best come up with a range of solutions which will help different people at different stages in their life to deal with that. But I think there definitely is both an economic and an environmental opportunity here, and this is why I think, as I say, the housing literature at the moment seems to be replete with people writing about green programs such as this, and a focus on the existing housing stock.
Wonderful. All right, one last question here that kind of dovetails that quite nicely, is again, with people being you know, out of work, on furlough, etc., and that kind of looking to last for quite some time. The investment in these sort of projects and a renter of any type takes on is quite large, as we've said, and then hopefully there'll be some, you know, various development of schemes off the back of this as well as others. But how do we, and I suppose, what is the project looking at in regards to keeping rent affordable? As you've mentioned a few questions back, there's a huge problem with affordability in the rental market, and with investment often comes higher rent prices. And what is this project specifically looking at around that, if anything?
Well, yeah, again, it depends on which segment of the housing market you're looking at, I guess. And again, it goes right back to that sense of what is the initial form of how the capital cost is met in the private sector in particular. The long-term objective here is to reduce heating costs and energy costs, which are clearly an important way of dealing with these things. How that factors into what the actual rents that have been set are, you know, that is a wider question about for instance, the government's approach to the free market allocation of rents in the private rented sector in Scotland, which is a currently very controversial topic, and you know, there may yet be forms of rent control around the corner, perhaps in the next Parliament, which you know, at least might limit the growth in rents, if, for instance, the Labour Party's proposal is accepted at some point in the future. So there are those kind of things going on, but it's equally true in the social rented sector. Yes, rents might be quite a bit lower, but the extent to which housing associations are effectively paying for, you know, the energy improvements that they are obliged to pursue, the EIS scheme, those sorts of things, then the extent to which that has to come out of their own resources ultimately comes out of rents. So rents are higher than they otherwise would be, or there are other investment programs that suffer because of that. So there are trade-offs and opportunity costs attached to that, and no one's again ignoring that or saying it's something that can be wished away. But you know, I think it's really about the trade-offs we make across a range of choices. As I said right at the beginning, if you can't make a standard for retrofit housing work in a city like in Glasgow, then the option is that some of those properties will not survive. I think that's the reality, I think, of what the climate change programme implies. So there's a series of choices to make. For other reasons, we may not end up with the kind of scale of tenemental housing that we've got just now, because they are all old. They are all, by definition, over 100 years old. And some of them will be more difficult to maintain, not just because of this, but because of other maintenance issues and quality issues. So not ignoring that or diminishing that, but I think there is an opportunity here. It can't work for everybody and for every tenure, but there may be, with thought and evidence, we might be able to find quite a lot of solutions that work for specific cases.
Yeah, this is such an interesting project. I'm sure myself, along with everyone else on this call, kind of looks forward to seeing how it unfolds, and over, and with time, seeing some of the outcomes of it. I think it'll be really interesting and informative in the way that the housing markets here, housing systems here develop. Thank you so much for telling us all about this wonderful project and giving us some insights into some of the considerations. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. And continue to watch the Catch website, etc., for more developments and how this project unfolds over coming months.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.